right, so we're going to go back to food for a moment. So what is this? I need to know because it looks delicious. Dr. Aman, are you able to hear me? Okay, great. And so this is a pretty traditional dish, I hear, right? And delicious. So how do you know how delicious this meal is? I would imagine that maybe a few of you might have competing evaluations. Maybe Dr. Adosa thinks his mother's dish is better than Dr. Adane's mother's dish, or better than Dr. Gosa's mother's dish. So how would you evaluate which, if you had 4 of these dishes in front of you from different mothers, how would you evaluate which one was the best? Or is there no evaluation because it's your mother? All right, I see a chat. Oh, tasting. You have to taste it, right? So that's a good first step. And maybe you also have some criteria that you're using. Maybe there's a particular amount of spice that your mother might add to this dish to make it even more delicious, more tasty. It's attractive. Ooh, nice. That's an excellent criteria. So how you presented it is also a way that you can assess it. Presentation, fantastic. And maybe by watching components. All right, so there are all of these various criteria that are emerging that help you evaluate this dish and whether or not it is poor, good, or excellent, right? And so you can think about that when you think about evaluation. So assessment is really this systematic collection of information about learning. You know, you're taking these different tools to collect information that you need and that your learner needs. But evaluation is this process of making a judgment about that. So you are judging the beauty, the deliciousness, the presentation of your mother's dish, just like you're evaluating the students in your course. And so oftentimes in teaching, and I mentioned this in part 1, we use assessment and evaluation interchangeably, right? But pedagogy recognizes this important distinction. And so if assessment is the systematic collection of information, then evaluation really is this process of making a judgment. And there are a few caveats that I'd like to mention. So evaluation is not grading, right? Grading is a process of ranking achievement, and it communicates something to students about their performance, right? If you pass or if you fail, for example. But ultimately, it communicates very little without a complete evaluation of how the learner performed relative to your criteria. So to be effective, evaluations and their metrics must be clear, well communicated, and understood by students so they can act on them. So I mentioned early on that rubrics are a particularly helpful way to do that. So rubrics are really those mechanisms by which we communicate to students what our goals are. And they're typically in the form of lists or tables. So who amongst this group has used a rubric before or seen a rubric? Dr. Bond. So I'm not seeing and Elizabeth, great. So rubrics might be a fairly new tool for you, and I will say that I love rubrics. They are one of the best ways for me to organize and evaluate my learners. And And so when we think about rubrics, rubric actually comes from the Latin word rubrica, or red. And it relates to red print that's used to direct readers to text of special importance. So what is this? Do you know this?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
Maybe someone speaking. So this image is from the Bible in classical Ethiopian, right? And so the red directs the reader to some ideas or words that are most important. So you can think about that with a rubric as well. How are you outlining what a learner has accomplished? So one of the reasons that rubrics are useful is that they accommodate any kind of assessment, because they're merely this transparent communication of the criteria by which you're valuing an assessment or an assignment. They set goals for the students and can motivate them. So hopefully this is not just an extrinsic motivation, but something that really drives them towards deeper learning in the course material. As we mentioned, one of the effective characteristics of assessment is that they're transparent, and that's what rubrics can help you do. And they're more likely to be valid and reliable when you've already written them down. So these objective measures like, ooh, I really like Dr. Gosa. You know, I think he's a great guy. Well, when I'm evaluating him, if I use a rubric, I'm probably assessing him more on his performance than me thinking that he's a good guy, right? So it creates a more objective playing field for you. It also enables you to distinguish between good and great work. So if we go back to your mother's dish and you're comparing it vis-a-vis another mother's dish, how do you distinguish between good and great? It reduces learner anxiety, stress, and cheating because they already know what they need to study and they direct their assignments towards the objectives and goals. And it allows you to give more efficient and timely feedback. So back to Dr. Hennick's question of how do I fit in assessments in a short window of time or when I don't have a lot of time to perform assessments? This is where rubrics come in. So a rubric is typically a set of scoring guidelines, which describes how work will be assessed and these differences, as I mentioned, between poor, good, and excellent work. So it's often depicted as a table where you have rows listing the criteria and columns listing the levels of proficiency. So for example, here you have criteria which include the problem of practice, the project overview, implementation plan, these different pieces that you're evaluating. And then you have your levels of proficiency: does not meet expectations, approaches expectations, exceeds, meets expectations, exceeds expectations. And then a description of what that means to you. So did they identify or define the problem of practice? If they did, then you already know that they have exceeded this category. If they haven't, then you would circle that, right? Because that's an area of a deficit that they need to address and they need to know that. So maybe they have included a problem of practice, but it's not really clearly defined, right? So then they've achieved this first level of proficiency, but not the second. So maybe they've done that. And so it's clearly defined and it aligns with the project scope. So they've met expectations, but maybe they've provided even more information that gives you a sense that they've really analyzed, synthesized, and applied more complex, higher level thinking. And so they may exceed expectation. And you can think about using Bloom's taxonomy when you create your rubrics. explicitly for these kinds of levels of proficiency, from the basic remembering up to the creating, depending on what those activities are. So for example, I have a rubric for a different rubric for different activities. I have a rubric for class discussions. I have a different rubric for writing assignments. I have a different rubric for class presentations. Some of those are very complex. Some of those are very simple, but each of them are aligned with the assignment and my goals for those assignments. So if we think about simple rubrics, there's some advantages to a simple rubric, right? That you can have, very few categories, and they can give you or give the learner feedback that's really personalized. So you can have your criteria, just a numerical scale and feedback. You can also do points. You can really structure this any way you would like, but you can have very simple rubrics, or you can have more complex rubrics. So this is a rubric actually that was developed by one of my professors at Vanderbilt when I was in college. So I love this because now I realize why I didn't do well in his class. No, I'm just kidding. I did fine in his class, but if you look, this is incredibly complex, right? So it took a lot of time to develop on the front end, but whoa, it can give your learner a lot of information on areas to improve. So you have your criteria here. So here there are a lot of criteria. You may only need 3 criteria for a given assignment, or you can have 9 or 10 criteria. It's up to you. And Dr. Hinnock, to your point, it depends on how much time you have, right? And you can also grade by letter grades. So this may help you if you're thinking about how you're ultimately evaluating the student. Do you need each of the assessments to correspond with a letter grade? Do you need for it to be numerical? Really, it's up to you. But you can see that it is very detailed. And maybe you find that at the end, if the vast majority of your learners' work needs improvement, then they'll know that they get a C on that assignment, but they'll have a sense of how they can improve, because you'll say, these are the things that I would expect for an A-level writing assignment, So it gives them a map and guidance for how they can improve, because we can all improve, right? Another example of a rubric might be something very simple, and a way that you collect and capture all of that information into just 4 categories. Maybe that they often miss key information on a patient history, or they able to gather complete medical history. Do they consistently gather that? And do they excel and gather more than is necessary? So do you see this theme where you're creating a table and you're giving those metrics, you're clearly delineating them, but you're not giving the answers to your learners. You're just telling them what you expect from them. And one thing that you can do is even invite your learners to develop rubrics with you. And this is a time saver. And it can be a way that you actually have your learners create a rubric based on your course goals and objectives so that they own that assessment. And we're actually going to do that right now with you as our learners. So we are going to break out into groups. I'll let you have some time for questions before we do, but to give you a sense of what we'll do next, we'll divide you out into each of your topical areas. And I want you to consider your overall learning objectives for your session, right? And be thinking about, you don't have to have this rubric complete by the end of your breakout session, but begin the process, because this will be an expectation by the end of the course. Begin the process for how you might develop a rubric. So considering your objectives, identifying what assessment criteria you might use, how you would structure it, How would you consider levels of proficiency using Bloom's taxonomy, and what each level of proficiency might look like from the lowest level to the highest level? And then make sure that it's clear, it's valid, it makes sense. These are building blocks off each other.